Oh, I think I have to hit got it. Yes, there we
Okay,
go.
perfect. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Meghan Sullivan, and welcome to a very special edition of History in Games. Today, we're talking all about Supergiant's action rogue game Hades and Hades 2. And I am joined by Professor Sarah Ils Johnston, a distinguished professor of religion at Ohio State University, who has written several books on the subject of ancient Greek religion and particularly the underworld aspects of it, which completely ties into Hades and what we're going to talk about today. And her books include, and for those who are listening at home, I'm holding up the first book. And for those watching at home, there might be a mirror effect. So just be aware. But I am holding up Restless Dead, Encounters Between the Living and the Dead in Ancient Greece, a book that I have referenced many times, talking about Hades and my coverage of the games. And also the just newly released Gods and Mortals, Ancient Greek Myths for Modern Readers. I actually stayed up past midnight reading parts of this book last night, so I'm really excited to have Professor Johnston here. Thank you so much for joining me. Yay!
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this, especially because I've been learning how to play Hades from my grandchildren, and I'm really bad at it, but I love doing it.
That actually is a perfect lead into my first question, which is sort of a two-parter, which is how did you become interested in Greek religion and particularly the underworld aspects of it? And also, what do you think of Hades?
Um, I don't know how I became interested in Greek religion. I've loved Greek myths since before I can remember. And when I was a child, it's what I wanted to read, and I read it obsessively. So then I studied it in college. But how I became interested in the underworld specifically draws us into something that I suspect we're going to talk about later. There's this corpus of hymns called the Orphic Hymns. And it was suggested to me that maybe I could do my dissertation on those because almost no one had worked on them at that point. The very first Orphic hymn is to Hecate. And as I started to do research on that first Orphic hymn, I thought, wow, Hecate is really cool. So I did my dissertation on Hecate instead of the Orphic hymns. And if you work on Hecate, sooner or later, you end up working on the dead. And I got fascinated with that. And so when one of my colleagues told me a couple years ago, there's this game called Hades, I just thought, I have to find out what this is. I like the game. I'm not very much of one for a first person shooter game. I prefer something like Myst. But as first person shooter games go, I think Hades is great. The graphics are incredible. It's interesting. So, yeah.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And the lore that you mentioned, the Orphic hymns, which is referenced a lot in the game, there's tons of lore about the Olympians and the underworld deities. And, when we talk about, later we'll talk about the main characters of Hades, which is Zagreus, and Hades 2, the new game that's coming out, stars his sister Melinoe. And it's interesting because even in Hades, the Olympians are, they're helping Zagreus, who is the main protagonist. He wants to leave the underworld. He wants to I don't want to spoil it too much, but there's reasons he wants to leave the underworld, but his father Hades is like, no one can leave the underworld. That's the rule. And so all the underworld deities try to stop him, and all the Olympian gods try to help Zagreus escape. And you immediately see this difference between how the Olympians do things and their skills and abilities, and then the underworld deities. And there's clearly two different deities going on, which reflects the actual real world beliefs of the ancient Greeks. And I thought sort of a good starting point is to maybe talk about the differences between how the ancient Greeks worshipped and addressed the Olympians compared to the way that they addressed the dead and underworld deities, because we have two different, very, very different rule sets going on here. And I thought, you know what? I'd like to know more about that.
I think before I talk about that, I'll just remind your listeners that Hades and Zeus are brothers. And the reason that Zeus is in the sky and Hades is in the underworld, at least according to Greek myth, is that when the Olympians won control of the universe from the Titans, the three brothers, Poseidon, Zeus, and Hades, drew lots to see who was going to get what. And so Zeus draws the sky, Poseidon draws the sea, and Hades draws the underworld. So in a way, they're equal, but you're absolutely right that in Greek religious practice, and certainly in Greek myth, they're presented as very different. So if you're worshiping the Olympians and you've got enough money, I should add, you want to sacrifice an animal that is white, or at least as white as you can get it, right? Because it's pretty hard to get a pure white animal. But if you're sacrificing to Zeus or Hera or Apollo or Artemis or Athena, you want the symbol, well, yeah, the symbolism of whiteness, of brightness. But if you're sacrificing to Hades or Persephone, or sometimes Demeter falls into this category too, or the dead, you sacrifice a black animal. And the reason I said if you've got enough money is that animals were super expensive in ancient Greece. So sometimes if you don't have enough money for that, you might give an Olympian a little gift like a tiny bit of incense, or maybe you sacrifice a bird instead of a big animal. When you're sacrificing to the underworld gods, you could still use incense or a bird, but another thing that you would sacrifice is honey. You'd pour honey into the earth, maybe honey mixed with milk or honey mixed with water. And it's got this enticing mysteriousness about it. The honey is obviously sweet. And although this is just what scholars think, I don't think any ancient source says it. It's almost as if you're saying to the underworld divinities, please be sweet, please be kind.
Wow. I never thought of the symbolism behind, giving them honey. And it did seem kind of strange. I was like, honey and wine. I mean, don't they, aren't they bloodthirsty? Aren't ghosts bloodthirsty? But I noticed that in your book, Restless Dead, that comes up a lot. Like a lot of the mixtures are pretty sweet and pretty nice and enticing. So that's interesting to think about. And, in the game Hades, you do have all of these underworld deities with all these different powers. And you mentioned again the Orphic hymns. So we have Zagreus, who I talked about in a previous History in Games episode. And then we have his sister Melinoe. And then we have other underworld gods that a lot of them are featured in the Orphic hymns. Can you talk about a little about the Orphic hymns? Because they clearly influence a lot of the storytelling in the game Hades.
Yeah, and that in itself fascinates me. And I'd love to know who's behind Hades, because whoever it is not your average person. If they know what the Orphic hymns are, I figure they're either a former classics major, or maybe even they have a doctorate in classics, because this is pretty obscure stuff. The Orphic hymns were a collection of hymns. I believe there's 88. Oh, I forgot to double check this before we started talking, but there's about 88. And they're all pretty short. And they're numbered already in antiquity from 1 to 88. They were composed probably in the 2nd century after Christ. And they basically are each a prayer to the divinity in question. So like one is to Athena, one is to Apollo, there's one to each divinity. And there are some divinities that we've never heard of, like Melinoe. We only really know her from the Orphic hymns. So it says what the divinity is. It prays to them to do something like be kind or keep away madness or whatever. It tells what kind of incense they like. So in the case of Melinoe, I think it's fresh herbs, as I recall. So in other words, we think that's meant to signal to the person using the hymns, if you're going to pray to this divinity, here's the incense they want. So that much is pretty obvious about the Orphic hymns. But something else that I think is really interesting, a scholar suggested back in 2009 that the order in which we find them is not just arbitrary, that this is meant to be a collection that you perform in the order in which it was written, and that you start at dusk, you keep performing throughout the night, and you end at dawn, and that the journey that you're making is sort of from increasing darkness and things to be afraid of through a slow kind of reassembling of order and brightness. And by the time you get to the end, and for example, one of the last hymns is to dawn, by the time you get to the end, you feel that your life has improved and that you've managed to propitiate the gods so that they will be kind to you.
That is really interesting, that theory that these were all prayers. They were said together as a collection. And was this part of an initiation process? Was this part of a mysteries where you had to be initiated and you heard these hymns?
Yes, that we all agree on, even before the 2009 article, that particularly they come down to us as under the title Orphic Hymns. And Orpheus was well known in antiquity. And of course, they thought he had really existed. Nowadays, most of us don't think he existed. Um, they thought of him as basically the religious expert. And he was also a really great singer and a really great composer of poetry. So it was believed that these were poems that he composed so that people could purge themselves of whatever was like inside their souls that was doing them harm and maybe that was going to cause them problems after they died and they were trying to get into the underworld or whatever. So let's see, what was I saying? Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the initiation cult. If people have heard of ancient mysteries, which are what the initiation cults are called, they probably know the Eleusinian mysteries to Demeter and Persephone. And that's a big, very well organized mystery that was based outside of Athens. Or maybe they've heard about the mysteries in honor of Dionysus, and that's sometimes where Zagreus comes in too. And those were preached by itinerant specialists who would go around the country and set up shop in a city for a little while and initiate people. But then there's also these littler mystery cults. And this is where we think the Orphic hymn one fits in, that we don't know that much about in any of the cases, but it seems to be a small group of people that sort of get together and say, hey, we all have an interest in the same thing. We all feel we need the same kind of spiritual help. So let's look at what Orpheus wrote and let's design a mystery cult.
Wow. And so some of the figures in this mystery cult include Zagreus and Melinoe. And Zagreus is fascinating to me because he's tied up in Dionysus, who's weirdly simultaneously the oldest and the youngest god in the Greek pantheon. You can trace him back all the way to Minoan Crete. And then he seems to come back into ancient Greece. He does sort of a loop-de-loop around the Mediterranean, and then comes back to ancient Greece centuries later. And something that caught my attention when we were going back and forth with email is that you were saying that even the name Zagreus might be a little problematic. So let's talk about who Zagreus is and sort of his very literally and figuratively shady origins.
He's shady in the sense that scholars just don't know enough about him to be very comfortable. You did a really good job, I think, covering him in your earlier podcast, especially the emphasis you put on the fact that we just have this very fragmentary literary knowledge of him. And in the 1800s, when the study of Greek religion was really beginning to take off in a scholarly manner, scholars got very excited about him because he seemed to be an example of what we tend to call dying and reviving gods. And another really good example, famous example of a dying and reviving god is Jesus, right? So they were saying, wow, the Greeks had this god that was very much like Jesus. And so they got very excited and they started talking about Zagreus as though we really could be sure about anything concerning him. But he's in truth this tantalizing name that we can barely really locate. And everything that you said in that podcast, I think, was accurate, that he seems to have an association with Dionysus, but we don't know exactly what. Some scholars nowadays think it's another name for Dionysus, like Dionysus in his wilder state. And that's basically where I lean.
Right. His name, I've seen scholars say this, but I haven't seen any complete agreement on it. But one theory is that his name means something like hunter.
Yeah.
Hunting, which is kind of unusual because it's like, how do you get from hunting and possibly being part of a bull cult in Crete, and then all of a sudden you're the party god Dionysus? Like, what's going on here?
But you have to remember that Dionysus is the party god, also in that very dangerous sense that if you party too much, if you drink too much, you do really awful things. Like the milder form, and I'm talking about myth here, I'm not talking about real cult. In myth, the milder form is if you've drunk too much and you're maddened by the wine, you might take a wild animal and tear it apart alive. And the worst version of that in myths is if you're really maddened by wine. And in these cases, it's because Dionysus hates you and he's caused you to get this mad, in that state, you might take your own child and tear it apart.
Wow.
So, um, if Zagreus means hunter, which I think is possible, not certain, but possible, I think it means hunter in that kind of dark, creepy sense of going after something that you mean to kill.
Wow. Well, that's when you think about that, that's pretty intense. And I noticed that even the ancient Greeks, like it's reported in Herodotus that wine can cause madness. In ancient Sparta, there was a king Cleomenes who's actually the older brother of Leonidas, famously of the Battle of Thermopylae, and he commits suicide. Although a lot of scholars think he was probably murdered. But the causes for suicide range from things that sort of fall into the category of the gods sending madness, which is he either was punished because he burned people to death in a sacred grove, he was punished because he messed with the mysteries just outside of Athens, or he drank too much wine. The Spartans like, we drank too much wine and went crazy. And it sounds like they really believe that if you drank enough wine, you could do truly terrible things.
Yeah, and of course, they're right. We know today if you drink enough wine, you can do really, really terrible things. All the Greek gods, well, with one exception that I'll get to later today, I think all the Greek gods were capable of doing really, really, really awful things and really, really good things. And usually they were sort of the inverse. So Apollo could keep the wolves away from your flock, but if Apollo was mad at you, he could send the wolves after your flock. That's a kind of simple example. So the Greeks knew that wine was this incredible gift, that it was this wonderful thing that made life better. Well, at least for men. Women weren't supposed to be drinking, but it made life better for men at least. But they also knew that wine was very, very dangerous. So Dionysus is the party god in both those senses, that he's a blessing of life, but he's also a horrible punishment if you've done something.
Right. And so that kind of leads us, we're talking about punishment, we're talking about these sort of powerful deities. If we talk about Melinoe and her, she's even more mysterious than Zagreus. There are only two sources that mention her. She's the upcoming, by the way, protagonist in Hades 2, which is Supergiant Games' first sequel ever, because Hades was so popular. It was so well received. They're actually making their first sequel ever, and it stars Zagreus's sister. And it's very strongly hinted that she is working together with a goddess we'll talk about in a second, Hecate.
Mhm.
And it's all about magic and sort of the underworld and darkness. But the only two sources we have on her are these bronze triangular tablets found in today what is Western Turkey, but would have been ancient Anatolia. And then we also have, of course, this one Orphic hymn to her specifically. Can you shed some light on her and her how she is attached to underworld goddesses like Hecate?
So in the Orphic hymn, she's said to be the daughter of Persephone and Zeus. Now, Zeus was the father of Persephone, so this is already kind of,
Right.
transgressive. But to make it even worse, Zeus disguised himself as Hades, Persephone's legitimate husband, in order to make love to her, or let's call a spade, in order to rape her, which is what it was.
Right.
So Zeus engenders Melinoe on Persephone through this horrible act of deception. And that already suggests, maybe Melinoe is going to be a somewhat strange goddess to begin with. And in fact, the Orphic hymn says that when Persephone finds out what Zeus has done, she gives birth to Melinoe in anger. So, as she's bearing this child, she's angry. Melinoe is called, the Greek would translate to be something like a phantom with two bodies. And it's not quite clear what that is meant to mean. But in any case, she can drive people crazy by sending phantoms to them. So, these kind of ghostly visitations. She herself is sometimes shadowy and kind of hard to discern. She usually appears at night. But on the other hand, especially when we get to the end of that Orphic hymn, it's said that she can save people from madness. So it's like Apollo and the wolves. She can send madness, but she can also cure madness. And thus, if you propitiate her, she's going to be helpful. And to go back to that that theory that the Orphic hymns are performed in order during the night. Melinoe appears more or less towards the end, and she appears in a group of divinities that are positive or that are just beginning to get positive. The hymn to Melinoe is appearing just before the hymn to very clearly propitious divinities like Dawn herself. And the other thing that's super interesting about the placement is her hymn appears right after the hymn to a group of goddesses called the Eumenides. And the Eumenides are the name for really fearsome goddesses called the Erinnues or the Furies. When the Erinnues or the Furies are in a good mood, Eumenides means sweetly minded. And in fact, that's pretty much what Melinoe's name means. Melinoe's name means, it's the root of the word for honey, mele, and noe means mind. So Melinoe is the honey-minded one. So she's being portrayed here as scary, but very definitely as someone who can be very kind as well.
Right. If we're sweet to her, maybe she'll be sweet to us.
That's a very good formulation. That's exactly the right formulation. So you burn your aromatic herbs for her and she'll be nice to you.
Right. It seems like there's a lot of, when we think about the Olympians, we think of worshiping them. But I noticed that with the dead and underworld deities, it's almost like we're trying to appease them. We're trying to stay on their good side. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, that's a fair thing to say. Persephone's a little bit tricky because Persephone has this commuting relationship, so to speak, that sometimes she's in the upper world with her mother Demeter, and sometimes she's in the lower world with Hades. When she is imagined to be in the underworld, as she is in certain cults, yeah, you're trying to propitiate her. When she's in the upper world, she receives sacrifices that are more like the sacrifices that the upper world gods receive. And in fact, going back to Orpheus for a moment, Orpheus was thought to be the expert on how you propitiate Persephone. And that's one reason that he was thought to be the poet who could best tell you about how to create a mystery cult that would do the trick.
Right. He even managed to convince Persephone and her husband to let his wife come back with him to the upper air, and then he messed it all up at the last possible second. And I just, oh no, dude, come on. You had one job, which was to bring your wife to the back from the underworld. All you had to do was not look behind you until you made it to the upper world, and at the last minute, you just had to turn around. And no,
Have you
oh
been able
man,
to this town?
yeah.
Yeah, I know. When my husband, who's also a scholar of religion, and actually now that I've raised my husband, he's the one who wrote that article in 2009 that made the argument about
Hey, it's all in the family. Love it.
his name is off. But anyway, so we went to see Hades Town when the traveling company was in Columbus, and we know darn well how the story turns out, but yet we were sitting there going, no, no, no.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you get really invested in the whole thing. I've meant to see Hades Town. I think I missed it when it was, has it come through the Orphic Theater in San Francisco? I don't
Oh,
know if it's come here or not. I thought I saw advertisements for it, but if it comes again, I'm definitely going because I've heard great things about it. It's supposed to be spectacular. Did you enjoy it?
I did enjoy it. And it turned out that another colleague of mine was in the audience too, another scholar of Greek religion. And we ran into her in the lobby on the way home. And she was also going, why couldn't he do it right? And I thought,
Right, we're so invested in these stories. And it's funny because you wrote this book called Gods and Mortals. It's all about how these stories stay with us. We're talking about Hades Town, we're talking about these stories, and people love a good ghost story, right? And this kind of segues into sort of the leader of ghosts, particularly angry ghosts, which is Hecate. She's going to be very prominently featured in Hades 2. She's obviously training Malinois to fight in the underworld. The whole premise of that game is the Titan of Time, Kronos, has escaped the underworld and is wreaking havoc, and it's up to Hecate and Malinois to stop him. And we don't know a lot about Hecate's role in the game. And I wanted to ask you, as the expert on Hecate, Who is she? Because when I'm doing research, she is so mysterious, and even her origins are so mysterious, and the evolution of her part in ancient Greek religion is fascinating. It changes completely over the centuries.
She was so fascinating that I never got past the first Orphic hymn in writing my dissertation. When I joked a moment ago that every Greek god has a positive and a negative side except for one, I meant Hecate. And you may think, what? The really awful side of Hecate was mostly developed by the early Christians who were trashing all the Greek gods, but they were particularly allergic to Artemis and any divinity associated with Artemis, because Artemis had a huge, powerful cult in the city of Ephesus. So the Christians spent a lot of effort trashing Hecate. And then writers like Shakespeare and Macbeth, they pick up on that and they make Hecate look very scary. This is not to say she couldn't be scary in antiquity. She could, but she is among the Greek gods. This is going to sound so uh, I'm trying to think of a better word than nice. I was about to say she's the nicest of the Greek gods, but what I mean is she is the least likely to hurt people. She's very helpful, both to mortals and immortals. Her earliest appearance, she helps Demeter figure out what has happened to Persephone after Hades snatches Persephone away. She later becomes a sort of lady in waiting, both to Persephone and Artemis. So she's helping these other two goddesses. She is the one who sometimes brings announcements, I mean, positive announcements from the gods down to people, and not just in myth, but in real life. She was believed to do that. And she also can help to carry prayers up from people to gods. And she also helps women conceive and give birth. She does become the goddess of ghosts, but I think, I can't prove this, but I'm pretty sure for what it's worth, I think she becomes the goddess of ghosts because just as she helps souls move from pre-life into life as a goddess of birth, she then helps souls get to the afterlife. And if you're the goddess who can take the soul to the afterlife, you're also the goddess who can bring it back up. And since magicians relied sometimes on ghosts to perform their spells, it's going to be Hecate that you ask for help in getting a ghost. And so Hecate gets this association with magic. And as the centuries go by, even before the Christians get hold of her, as the centuries go by, she does get this scary aspect, because if someone's performing magic against you, you know, that's already horrible.
Right.
So that's my little pitch for pro Hecate. You know, don't think Hecate's all bad. She's not even half bad in antiquity. She's largely positive. And actually, as time goes on, she develops this role. She's called savior. It's the female version of the term that's used to describe Christ. So she's a savior in the sense that she can not only help you get into the afterlife, but help you get into the good part of the afterlife, the part of the afterlife where you're going to have a happy existence. So that's Hecate, or at least basic Hecate in a nutshell. Why don't you ask me questions that you have about her, though? Because there's so much I could say about Hecate.
There, you know, there is. And let me just quickly consult my notes here, because I do have a ton of questions about Hecate. And, you know, you mentioned, actually, I'll hold up Restless Dead again, because I really love this book. It's one of those things where you either, when you love a book, you either treat it very preciously or you take it everywhere like a security blanket. I'm the latter. You can see it's all highlighted and it's dog-eared and underlined and notes. And I love it so much. And then you have actually a whole chapter dedicated to Hecate and the dying maiden, and talking, and it's a good segue into ghosts, the angry ghosts she can control, because they're different. They're the normal people who die normally and they're fine. And, you know, Hermes takes them down to Hades and they, you know, they go through the underworld. And, but then you have those ghosts who are locked out of the afterlife. And I'm curious about those ghosts, and those are the ghosts that Hecate can control. And you even mentioned that there are specific types of ghosts associated with how they died. They either died violently, before their time, they weren't buried correctly. The ancient Greeks were legitimately terrified of ghosts.
Yeah, well, because they really did feel that if you died wrong or if your body was handled wrong after death, that was it. As you just put it very nicely, that you're going to be trapped between life and death, between the upper world and the underworld, and you're wandering miserably. So those who aren't buried, if their ghosts come back to make trouble, that's pretty easy to take care of. You either find the body and bury it, or if you can't find the body anymore, you give them funeral rites anyway, and then they're probably going to be happy and leave you alone. If someone dies violently, like they've been murdered, then you have to avenge their murder. And that gets tricky because sometimes you have to murder someone else to avenge a murder. Like in myth, Orestes, his mother Clytemnestra kills his father Agamemnon. And Apollo tells him through the Delphic Oracle, if you don't avenge your father's death, I will send madness upon you. I will send leprous, scaly, oozy blisters upon you. You must avenge your father. But of course, to avenge his father, he has to kill his mother, Clytemnestra. And Clytemnestra rouses the Arenoes, these goddesses of vengeance, who then pursue Orestes and start to drive him crazy. And eventually Athena has to step in and say, enough, I'm going to hold the very first murder trial and we'll see what happens. And the murder trial ends with a split jury, half in favor of Clytemnestra's ghost and half in favor of Orestes. Athena casts the deciding vote in favor of Orestes. So that's how Orestes finally gets off the hook and out of trouble. But you can see that avenging murder can, in real life, recycle and recycle and recycle. And this was, speaking of real life, it did also happen famously in Athens in the 7th century, when members of a very prominent Athenian family were murdered at altars dedicated to these goddesses who were very closely associated with the Arenoes. So then a plague strikes Athens, and ghosts start to haunt the city, and there's all kinds of new trouble, being brewed because of this. Sooner or later, Apollo again tells them, you have to build new altars to the goddesses who are offended, and you have to build them a new temple too. And then they will essentially call off the plague and call off the ghosts. So it's kind of like in the story of Orestes and how Athena gets him off the hook by setting up the jury system. This gets so bad that it really takes divine intervention on the part of the city's goddess to finally put a rest to it. And so those were rather elaborate situations because, first of all, the myth about Orestes, that's one of the most famous myths in ancient Greece. And authors tell it over and over and over. And the other situation, the real life situation in Athens, which is sometimes called the Chylonian affair, that was also a really big deal. But some kind of smaller scale things that people did, that sounds like people were murdering each other all the time in Athens. That's not what I mean.
They kind of were, though, weren't they? The intra-elite, like constantly killing each other for power. I mean, even up to, the birth of democracy was bloody and messy. I mean, Hipparchus got stabbed.
That's a good point. So something else that you could do if you murder, I feel like now I'm giving advice to mass murderers, but something else that you can do is
theory
is you dip your finger in their blood, lick your finger, and then 3 times you spit it out. And it's as though you are, on the one hand, acknowledging that you committed the murder by taking the blood into you, but on the other hand, saying, I'm now casting the murder away from me. So that's another way of dealing with it. But the primary way is to avenge the murder. So in other words, if you're the son of the guy who gets murdered, it's not just Orestes in myth, but if you are the son of a man who gets murdered in real life, you have to avenge that murder. And even if, let's say, you're a very rationalist person and you say, I'm not afraid of ghosts, you will lose your social standing if you don't avenge the murder of your father or your mother or another close family member.
Right. It affects the whole family. It can affect a whole city state. And these angry ghosts are truly angry. If we talk about ancient Sparta, and they were super conservative and religious. There was the Leonidas comes up again. His family's pretty active in the 5th century BCE, and Leonidas's nephew, the king regent Palsonius, he's a victor at the Battle of Plataea. He racks up 2 other impressive victories against the Persians. I have always had an issue of the way he's portrayed in historical sources, particularly Thucydides, who usually doesn't go off rails and tell folklore kind of tales. And the whole way that Pausanias is portrayed as suddenly becoming arrogant, wanting to work with the ancient Persians during the Persian Wars when he's supposed to be fighting them. It never rang right to me, and something goes terribly wrong. And Pausanias is essentially murdered by the Spartans. He's starved almost to death in a temple, and they take his body out of the temple just in time for him not to technically pollute the temple. But that doesn't work. And according to the oracle at Delphi, they needed to appease Pausanias' angry ghost for this straight up murder by creating not 1, but 2 statues to him, which I find unusual because there's only one Pausanias, but apparently his anger was that great. And the Spartans were hoping this would help appease his ghost. And I'm kind of wondering why, because you mentioned it in Restless Dead, and I'm sure the audience is curious, why did sometimes the Greeks believe that by creating a statue and either sending it out to the wilderness or chaining it to a rock or putting it in front of a temple, how is that meant to appease a ghost? What's the connection there?
Well, if I knew that, I'd be more famous than I am. It's a question that has really bothered a lot of us. The study of this kind of stuff, by which I mean the more mysterious side of Greek religion, that really got going when I was a graduate student. And so there's a bunch of people about my age who have worked on this stuff. And we don't have a good answer to that. Here's the kind of answer we do have. We noticed that the Greeks did a lot of other interesting things with statues. For example, the myth about Actaeon, who accidentally sees Artemis when she's naked, and Artemis, in fury, even though this was an accident, turns him into a stag and sends his own hunting dogs off to kill him in his form as a stag. And of course, the dogs don't know what they've done, and they go looking for their master so that they can show their master, look, we killed a stag. And of course, they can't find Actaeon. And finally, the centaur Chiron realizes what's going on. Chiron's very wise, and he can't do anything to help Actaeon, but he feels sorry for the dogs. And so he creates a statue that looks like Actaeon and puts it where the dogs are, and the dogs all gather around it and lie down and peacefully, snooze. So there's this idea in Greece that the statue is somehow almost as good as the real thing. The other really interesting case of it brings us back to the Restless Dead, that the Greeks sometimes, or rather I should say the Greek experts whom we would call magicians for hire, they sometimes would create little tiny statuettes. And if you wanted to curse someone, you could write the name of the person on the statuette, or rather, again, the magician would do this, write the name of the person on it. And then they would do terrible things to the statue, like twist its arms behind its back, twist its legs behind its back, do something maybe like turn its head around backwards, stick pins through it. And the logic here is not the same as a voodoo doll. You're not sticking the pin through it to make it, to kill it, but to make it feel the force of the magic in that part of the body. So there again, it's this idea that if I were to, God forbid, make one of these little dolls and write Meghan on it, that would be like you. I could affect you through it. So the story of Pausanias kind of fits into that range of weird lore about statues. What really stands out, though, is what you emphasized as well in your telling, that they make 2 statues. And that's the part that, for those of us who have worked on this material, we're going, why? Why 2?
Right. Because he was twice as angry. I have no idea, right? But it's interesting because, okay, so you have the angry ghosts, but not all of the underworld deities and mortals were angry, particularly, well, sort of segue into heroes. And I'm fascinated by the cult of heroes because they're not except for maybe Hercules, Heracles, and a couple others, most of them are considered mortal. The ancient Spartans and the ancient Athenians, they would actually go searching for the bones of heroes to bring back to their city states, to benefit the city state for some reason or another. Actually, this is a good opportunity to sort of re-promote Adrian Mayer, who is the author of The First Fossil Hunters, has a really compelling theory about, the ancient Greeks really thought that the heroes were real and these bones were real, and that these bones may very well have been the bones of either very tall men, prehistoric mammals, or even dinosaurs that were close to the soil in ancient Greece. Farmers up until recent times would still dig up bones of dinosaurs and prehistoric mammals. These look heroic. You see, my own theory is you see these Mycenaean ruins and tombs everywhere, and you think heroes lived in those, heroes are built in those. So they believed that the heroes were real, and yet, I got to ask why they love them so much, because, to our modern sensibilities, these heroes, these ancient Greek heroes, Theseus, Odysseus, Achilles, Perseus, they're not very nice.
Nope.
They're jerks. They're
Right.
kind of terrible. So I guess my question is two-part, which is, number one, how did the ancient Greeks define a hero? Because we think of them as self-sacrificing and doing something for the greater good. That wasn't necessarily the case for ancient Greek heroes. And why did they believe that they were so real and could benefit a city state or even just individuals?
They certainly weren't very nice a lot of the time. So it was the idea that if you're stronger than average, or more powerful than average in life, you're probably going to be more powerful than average after death. And that's particularly the case if your father is a god. So like Perseus's father was Zeus, Theseus's father was Poseidon. Heracles actually becomes a god. His father was Zeus, but he's a special case. So if you're really powerful while you're alive, you're likely to be powerful while you're dead. And therefore, humans would be smart to kind of worship you even more than they worship the rest of the dead. And by worship the dead, I mean, there were certain festivals of the dead in ancient cities, a little bit like our Halloween, more or less, where you would pay special attention to the dead and try to make sure that they'd be nice to you the rest of the year. But heroes, these really powerful dead, you had to pay attention to them maybe more often. And in particular, typically every city had its own special hero, like maybe someone who was believed to be one of their ancestors. So in Athens, for example, you better make sure that you pay attention to Theseus, because he could be really good to the city of Athens if he was happy, but he could be really bad if he was not happy. And it might actually also be worth mentioning the female equivalent of this, which brings us back to the Restless Dead, that if a woman died before she had married and had children, she was considered incomplete. And so she was one of these ghosts that wandered in between the worlds because she couldn't get into the dead because she was incomplete, but she was no longer alive. Similarly, those female ghosts could be really, really, really angry. And if you didn't propitiate them with certain special kinds of gifts, but also avert them by doing things such as on a certain day every year, you would put pitch, so kind of a tarry substance that you get from pine trees. You put pitch around the doors and the windows so that her ghost, which is thought to be walking the earth for that one day a year, can't get in. So heroes, when we talk about that word in ancient Greece, we're talking about men, but the female dead could be powerful and scary too.
Was there any way to appease them at all? Was there any ritual where, these very scary ghosts could be appeased at all, or were they just kind of stuck?
They were stuck in the sense that there was nothing you could do to get them into the underworld, unlike, say, the murder victims or the people who aren't buried. But you could keep them out of your house by doing things like the pitch, right?
Right.
So that's the version. But you could also appease them. For example, the one in Athens, whose name is Erigone, who's a girl who committed suicide because her father is murdered and she's a virgin and she knows that without her father, she's never going to get married. So she decides, I'm just going to kill myself. She comes back and causes all the other young women in Athens to kind of go crazy and start hanging themselves. So the Athenians are finally told, again by the Delphic oracle, create two ceremonies that will appease Origone. One of them will be called the swinging, but instead of like swinging from a noose, the way that the girls were doing, build, what we call swings from trees and make the girls swing back and forth once a year. And any girl, who's swinging back and forth won't hang herself. And the other was a special dance, which was called the Wanderer. And it was supposed to imitate how Origone went out desperately looking for her father and then discovered his murdered corpse. And so this is supposed to appease her. So there are weird little rituals like that that help to keep the dangerous female dead under control.
It's interesting because in Hades 2, when I was looking through the footage, I noticed that there were trees and there was rope wrapped around it. And I'm wondering if that is a very, very subtle reference to this idea of these hanged virgins and sort of going back to underworld deities like Melinoe and Hecate and these angry ghosts. And it's I don't know if I'm right about that, but when you mentioned the swinging, I thought of that immediately. It's like,
I would be so thrilled if Origone made her way into Hades too, because I don't know, call me perverse and weird, but the myth of Origone has always particularly been one of my favorites. I just find
it's a very powerful story.
Yeah.
And there's a version of it where she's actually a half sister to, I never get this name right, Iphigenia, who is the daughter who is sacrificed right before the war gets started in Troy. That's part of Orestes' story, which his sister is sacrificed to create these winds that will sail all the ships to Troy to get Helen of Sparta back. And that's what kicks off this whole murder cycle. And it's not really recognized, but you have these virgins who are sacrificed or who become angry ghosts, and it seems like there's some acknowledgement about women's anger in this mythology, which I find kind of interesting.
You're absolutely right that there's that other version of Origone's story, but just to make things even weirder, I'll tell you another story that people don't tend to know. So the version of the story of Iphigenia that we know is that at the last minute, as she's about to be sacrificed to Artemis, sweeps her off the altar, puts a deer in her place, which is what really gets sacrificed. And then Artemis carries Iphigenia off to this distant land where she has to serve as a priestess. But there's another version of that story, which is quite old. It's as old as Hesiod, and which we know the Greeks really liked because we get little allusions to it for centuries and centuries and centuries, according to which when Artemis takes Iphigenia off the altar, saves her from being sacrificed, Artemis turns her into the goddess Hecate.
And there it is. It just full circle. That is so interesting.
I know.
Yeah, it's and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on, because Hecate is not like a straight line, right? Like there are many different stories about her. Her origins aren't even necessarily in Greece, but she becomes adopted into the religion and evolves where she goes from, sort of a torchbearer and handmaiden Persephone all the way up to the savior of the universe, which is a pretty impressive arc. And I can't wait to see sort of the role that she's going to play in Hades too. And with that, I think the last thing we can talk about, because I'm really excited to talk about this, is your new book, Gods and Mortals, Ancient Greek Myths for Modern Readers. And I think this will be very informative to people who are playing Hades and they kind of want to know more about the myths and stories, because not just underworld deities, but for example, Theseus appears in Hades and he's a hilarious jerk. And you have, sinners like, Sisyphus also is in the game and he's got his little boulder Boldy and it's very cute. And in Hades 2, there's going to be Nemesis appears, Doom appears. And I'm curious to know, in terms of heroes, if someone like the cover has of course, Jason getting the golden fleece, which is sort of fun, but sort of I'm curious to know about the heroes and gods that you write about, and what inspired you to write this particular book?
Because I teach mythology, and I've been teaching mythology for years, and I realized slowly that there were a lot of books on mythology out there that keep interrupting the stories. So they'll say, I'm going to tell you the story of Theseus, and they start telling it, and then the author allows his or her voice to intrude again and say, now, what this part of the myth means is blah, 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 blah. And it's important to think about what a myth means, but to really experience a myth the way that the Greeks experienced it, it has to be a story. And when someone is telling you the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, they don't pause to say something like, and so children, remark, Goldilocks is not doing what she was supposed to do, and this may get her into trouble. That's not a story. And so I wanted to tell them as stories. But the other kind of mythology book I kept running into out there were books that tell them as stories, but the people didn't know what they were talking about. And so I once, for example, found a book that said Dionysus was the god of the sun. And I thought, I mean,
Whoa, wait a minute.
that was egregiously bad, but I found so many little mistakes. So neither of these kinds of books were the kinds of books that I wanted to give my students, or for that matter, my grandchildren. So I decided I'm going to draw on what I've learned in 36 years as a scholar and teacher of Greek myth to tell the stories in a way that accurately reflects the ancient sources, but that I hope is also engrossing and makes you want to read them.
Right. Well, one of the things that I like is that you add in little interesting historical details, though. Like when I was reading about Clytemnestra and Agamemnon, and he's coming home from Troy, and she rolls out literally a red carpet. You sort of add that dye is very expensive and actually comes from little sea creatures. And it's just little things like that that are sort of naturally woven into the story, little details like that don't interfere with the story, but are just like, oh, that is an interesting little fact. So I appreciate those little details, and I definitely think the audience is going to appreciate details. And I'll put it in the B-roll, but also your book comes with very beautiful artwork. Do you want to talk about that?
The jacket illustration, the end papers, which are maps, and then there's 15 drawings inside the book. Those were all done by my son, Tristan Johnston, who's a professional artist based in LA. And of course, heard these myths as a child. And it was really fun to do this with him, especially because it turns out we did not have the same ideas in a lot of cases. And we had to, I think the polite word is negotiate. But the final thing I'll say, if you hold up the book just one more moment, I wanted a picture that would have a monster, but also a powerful woman. And in this case, that's Medea. But the more Tristan and I talked about it, we decided we both thought Jason was really a dweeb. And so Jason looked a little bit dweeby in that picture.
You know what? I actually looked at it, and Medea does look extraordinarily powerful. She's clearly in control. She knows what she's doing, and he looks a little dorky, and I kind of love it. I'm kind of here for it. And meanwhile, you have this dragon-like monster, which is beautifully illustrated. And then, of course, you have the golden fleece in gold so that you can't miss it. So it's I really like the light and shadowing in these illustrations. And then throughout the book, you see more illustrations, and it sort of brings these stories to life. So you can get Gods and Mortals. It's out there right now. You can, I got my copy via Amazon, and it's, there's bookstores you can get it on Amazon and other places that you can buy it. And tell the nice people, the audience, where they can find you. Are you on social media? Do you have any upcoming, secretly, I know you do, interviews that you want to advertise?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you my website, because that'll have the details of upcoming stuff. So I'm going to spell my name, because that's my website all run together. Sarah, Sarah, and then my middle name Iles, Iles, and then my last name Johnston, Johnston. So if you run all that together and then add .com, you'll get to my website, and that has a link for appearances. But the one I'm doing in 6 days is for a British TV show called Intelligence Squared. And it's going to happen at, I think it's 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time in America. Yeah, because 6 o'clock British time. So that will be an hour long, actually 40-minute long interview and then 20-minute question session. And then in late April, I think it's on the 26th, I am giving a virtual lecture for the Smithsonian Institute on, and if you're a Hades fan, this will interest you. They've asked me to talk about myths of death.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor Johnston, for coming on my podcast. I'm so excited that you came.
I've had such a blast. This has been such an entertaining conversation, Megan. Thank you for having me. And I definitely second what you said about the game Hades.
Yes, it is fun. Everyone, go out there and play it. All right. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. See you later.